The content in this episode is meant for educational purposes only and is not meant to serve as a recommendation for, prescription for, or doing anything with the compounds that we talk about today.
Welcome back to the Thermo Diet Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jayton Miller, and I'm here with the boss man himself. How you doing today, Chris?
What up? Glad to be back.
So today we're talking about a very fun topic, the topic of psychedelics.
Yeah, so Jayton mentioned that a lot of people have been asking about psychedelics. Is that since the last Think Again episode?
I noticed that it has gone up in the group since then, yeah.
Yeah, for those of you who are listening and haven't watched that Think Again episode, just search for Think Again Serotonin on YouTube. You can watch it. Talk about the interplay between kind of the history of serotonin and the health issues associated with excess serotonin, and then how it's like strangely very interlaced with the rise of the psychedelics in modern times. So I thought it was interesting. I thought it was pretty awesome. Pretty well written.
Yeah. So whenever you talk about psychedelics, what kind of comes to mind? Like, what's your definition of psychedelics?
I guess a couple things. So obviously the mind-altering effect of it, but that doesn't really cover everything, right? Because you can use a lot of things for mind-altering effects, like caffeine even. But psychedelics, for whatever reason, tend to have just this like universally similar aspect to them of like opening up somebody's mind, for lack of a better term, and like making them increasing awareness, increasing like a euphoria sense, but it's not necessarily even a positive euphoria all the time. It could be both negative and positive in some ways. Whereas like, other drugs you could say like Molly would increase euphoria or ecstasy or that sort of thing, but it's not considered a psychedelic drug. I would personally, I think they're all like I'm not in, in like the drug classification world of like all the different stuff that people do, but I think those sorts of things like ecstasy would be like kind of on the edge of a classification of psychedelic, but not. I tend to reserve those like that classification typically for stuff that is like psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, like, which is basically DMT. And even psilocybin, like the active ingredient psilocybin is psilocin, and it's like a form of DMT. So it's almost like DMT is kind of at the root of a lot of that class of psychedelic drugs, and like peyote and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of what I think of, where it's like this way more powerful and positive experience that's used by the people that use it aren't using it for like party drugs. They're using it more for like a mind-opening effect, positive effect long term.
And they work as serotonin antagonists, correct?
Yeah, the biochemistry is pretty complicated, especially due to the fact that like researchers don't know exactly why yet about how a lot of this stuff works. They do know that like psilocybin, for example, the psilocin binds to the 5-HT2A receptors. And but I've also read studies on, and I took a lot of neuroscience like coursework in addiction modeling and like addiction studying in college, and it was heavily focused on more illicit drugs like cocaine. And a lot of what they know about that is that, like, cocaine also binds to the same receptors. Amphetamines also bind to the same 5-HT2A receptor, but they have a very different downstream effect and very different addiction tendencies. Whereas something like psilocybin is almost impossible to get addicted to. Probably is impossible. I've never seen somebody like actually get addicted to it. But it's, the psilocin itself is binding to the same receptor that cocaine or the compounds in amphetamines and the congeners that they use for binding those and that sort of stuff. It's all binding to those similar receptor sites and the 5-HT2C. What they've come down to, as far as I know, is that it's not just the simple, and it's very convenient. Like a lot of the whole receptor bind model thing is like, it's so simplified. Be like, this binds to that receptor, so it must do this. It's not true. There's a lot more going on, because what happens is like whatever the compound is itself that's binding, even though it can fit in that receptor site and it has an affinity for it, triggers different effects downstream. So, which, those cascades are extremely complicated. And that's what as far as I know, that's what people are still trying to figure out. And they, like, the 5-HT2A theory was just a theory really until last year. And there was a more definitive study that looked at it. I pulled that up here. And really, but they don't even say much in this study other than, like, we have a lot of evidence that with psilocybin, it is binding to that receptor site, but they're not really elaborating on now what, like, why is it different than cocaine hitting the same receptor site? So what they say in that, they had like 3 findings that they came out with out of that study was the higher the psilocybin dose, the more 5-HT2A receptors were occupied in the brain. So it makes sense if it's binding to those receptors. The receptor occupancy hit the highest, or hit 72% at the highest dose, which they were only using 30 milligrams, which is a very, very low dose. When people talk about like heroic dose mushroom trips, they're using 5 grams plus, right? And, I personally don't even trip unless it's about 1 to 1.5 grams, depending on if I have anything in my stomach or not, really. So, and even that's like more of a light thing. So I'm not sure why they were only measuring that small of an amount, but they measured between 3 and 30 milligrams. And they did note that, 72% occupancy at 30 milligrams is quite a lot. So you'd imagine that it seems correlative of, like, the higher the dose, the more these receptor sites are being bound. The next thing they saw was the amount of psilocin in the blood plasma and the calculated receptor occupancy in the brain were strongly related. The authors stated that they conform to a single site binding model. So they're thinking that like this is really the receptor site that it's going after. And then the third thing was the intensity of the subjective effects had strong correlations to receptor occupancy in the brain. So that's basically like, determined through like surveys and questionnaires from the subjects. But I'm not like deep into pharmacology of psychedelics, and I've read a fair amount about it, but I'm not like super obsessed with it. So I'm, potentially missing something here. But as far as I understand, even with the relation of like the cocaine and amphetamines and that sort of thing, and what we would consider a psychedelic drug, what it really comes down to is the compound's effect on that receptor site, triggering, the binding really triggering a very, very different cascade of effects throughout the brain. And so like psilocybin, LSD, as I explained in the serotonin episode, are serotonin antagonists. So they tend to be basically dopaminergic in the same way that, something like cocaine is dopaminergic. However, then you also have like feedback loops, which people never take into account. So you could be like a chronic cocaine addict and end up having very different long-term effects from it in terms of your physical health and the rest of your body. So it's not a very simple subject. And there's a lot of emerging science around it now, finally, which also, if you watch that episode, you'll know why. But, obviously all research into LSD and psilocybin was really just cut off in the 70s. And, it was completely outlawed really across the world due to governing bodies, claiming it as illicit of a drug as something like heroin or that, but now we're seeing a resurgence in it, mostly due to MAPS, as far as I understand. MAPS, the organization that's leading like the research aspect of using psychedelics in therapeutic settings. But they are using stuff like MDMA as well. So it's with good results. So maybe MDMA would be considered a psychedelic in that sense. It's just not the first thing I think of. But I did watch that Business of Drugs on Psychedelics, or was it on Psychedelics or just MDMA? I don't know. Did you watch that?
I haven't watched it yet.
It was MDMA. Yeah, it was interesting because I think they got it out of. So you basically can distill. The first guy that distilled MDMA was just out of it was out of sassafras, the plant. And then they tell the whole story about how like this was just a husband and wife, like, you know, chemists, good chemists. They're renowned chemists, but they were, you know, experimenting with all these things, and they found that. And then they have this whole like legal battle because they got raided by the DEA or something, and like, even though it wasn't illegal technically, they just had this like sassafras concoction. But yeah, that's kind of the story of anybody that invents one of these things, like the LSD thing. You know, I think it was within 2 years of it being discovered, it was fully controlled by the CIA, the entire world's population of it. And Sandoz Laboratories eventually, you know, like obviously they couldn't use it. Their patent expired, and they ended up having to sell. They were selling all of it to the CIA before their patent expired, and then they couldn't use it out in the applications that they were actually trying to use it for initially, which was like psychotherapy and schizophrenia treatments. So it's an interesting world, the world of controlling drugs. Yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about psychedelics? What are some of the questions also that people ask?
So most of them are just curious as to like the health effects of them, short term and long term. So, you know, whenever you're actually having an experience under the influence of one of these substances, like what's going on, and then like what are the long-term repercussions of what's going on. So that's what I commonly see inside of the group specifically. Yeah, but as far as like my perception of them, I enjoy them. I think they're good. I don't think that they're necessarily bad. I think there's a lot of misconceptions whenever it comes to psychedelics specifically. I also think that people aren't responsible with the use of substances such as that.
Yeah, how so? How would someone not be responsible?
Well, let's see.
Like I kind of know with MDMA. Yeah, that's kind of obvious.
Obtaining it for one is difficult. Environment is number two, because you can either have a perfect environment or an absolutely terrible environment that, you know, you can have two very different outcomes from just the environment itself that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that comes with the internal environment as well. So like, what headspace are you in? And are you actually examining the internal state that you currently are in before you're going into that experience?
Yeah, I've found that that's probably the most important thing. And, you know, just, it's very general and it seems obvious, but most people don't realize it until after the first time they don't do it right. But with those compounds, you know, they're really, from what I've observed pattern wise, it seems to just be a reflection of like your internal state in general, and it amplifies it. So I've known people that have had really, really bad trips, while other people at the same time, like the friends of theirs that sitting on the same beach, are having an amazing time. So, and they use the same exact batch of it. That's really important. And also dosing, dose makes the poison, like anything. Like people need to really pay attention to dosing. You don't want to just like go into a heroic dose and you don't even know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Because especially if you're not in the right environment. And I've, personally, it's like, I think something like psilocybin is very great. It's a good compound for like exploring and appreciating nature more. I don't think it's even possible to not like notice nature under those circumstances. And then but it's more than noticing. You end up just like deeply appreciating it, and you're like, wow, this is incredible. So there's something, and there's a lot of, I've read stuff on like, the mythology aspect of it, and like the history of mushrooms in terms of like coevolution with humans.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of theories about it. Obviously the stoned ape theory, I think, is like the biggest one.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of interesting stuff in mythology that gets tied in with all of it, and there's a lot of interpretations of it too. It doesn't mean every single one of them's right. Like I've read a lot of different more mythological stuff, like even the Carl Jung and Eric Newman stuff, that's directly, tied in. You see a pattern between that and like, some psychedelic researcher. I have this book, can't remember what it's called because it's got the shittiest branding I've ever seen, but it's like an all white book, but the title's like imprinted in it. But it's pretty good, but really what it is a collection of essays from researchers and some of them look at like the mythology aspect of it and the symbolism that's involved. And they can translate it. I've noticed patterns between their history arguments and stuff that you would read in Carl Jung's writings, that are interesting, but it doesn't mean you need to just buy into it, but it's really interesting in terms of history.
Yeah, that is kind of fascinating because Jordan Peterson talks a little bit about that in his kind of series over the psychological significance of the biblical stories. He talks about the shamanic experience whenever he's talking about Jacob's ladder and how the entire experience itself, whenever he visualizes a ladder to heaven, could have actually been a psilocybin trip because they were known during that time to have frequent psilocybin trips in that area specifically.
Mm-hmm. And maybe the prevalence of visions and that sort of thing.
And that's like a common replicable vision that's been seen among many different people is some kind of stairway or ladder to the sky or some kind of greater unknown.
Like another common one with DMT especially is like people just blasting out of their body and like flying through the air, but then going into space and like going through a door of some kind, like up in the clouds or something. There's a lot of, that's an interesting aspect to these things that I don't have an answer for, and I haven't seen anybody that has, but the archetypes that are involved with it, because if you again draw it back to someone like Jung, who was known to use these compounds, and then his like analysis of like the collective unconscious concepts, and the archetypes involved, and kind of the idea that like everything really falls into some archetypical structure. That's, I think, fascinating, but it's definitely one of those things that like the more you read about it, it could be like this never-ending road where you're like, oh God, I just learned something else. I got to go look into that too. But if you like learning, then the never-ending road is just part of the process. But that's something biologically I'd be really interested in people studying now that research is opening up for this stuff. Is there any way to predict an archetypical experience based on the biological events? And can they, I think the answer is completely yes, but then can they determine what those events are? Which is the little bit more difficult of a thing. It requires a lot of time and a lot of money in the research because most researchers are only and especially even lab setups, they're set up to study like one thing or one set of things over and over and over. So you'd have to take it, and it's unfortunate. I wish there was like some super labs that could they had like an ability to launch a study like this, but they had 100 researchers like looking at all different aspects of it that they were really specialized in, and then like piece it all together and do it over and over and over and figure out what are the patterns that elicit certain things. But then the subjective nature of that is that you might end up at the end of the study with people just because of like biochemistry at the moment in that person's body, and everyone is completely different in the way, like structurally you're not, but like when they show up to a study, their biochemistry is going to be it's going to vary greatly in terms of deficiency levels, bacteria influences, and even just like degeneration over time and different ages and that sort of thing. So it'd be pretty hard to nail that, I think. But it'd be interesting if people are studying it, read it.
Like in the experience itself, what is kind of your perception of that enhanced stimulus that it's coming in?
Like when it starts,
And then
vision.
Okay.
Yeah, color, vision. Yeah, like my vision gets real sharp.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is that awareness thing. It's like it starts, you just become aware of other stuff and patterns. Even if it's not at like full on, like all the light is breaking into color, but you notice patterns in everything. Really, you can even see like extreme detail in like a drywall, or something. Like it's crazy the level of awareness that hits at that point.
So, do you think that that reality isn't perceived by the basic biological organism because we don't have the ability to compensate with that amount of stimulus?
I think it's a filtering effect. Yeah, I took a semester on perception in college, which was really interesting. They didn't go into any of this, which they should have. That would have been really interesting. But it was based on just like perception organs and how they interact with the brain and what we know about it. And really a persistent, theme or motif in that whole thing is just that the brain filters to conserve energy, really. So your perception normally, and there's another cool thing I'll touch on with this too, is like, but your perception in your everyday life is constantly filtering everything in terms of like your conscious ability to see it and recall it and smell it and whatever it is, hear it, especially hearing is a good filter. I think hearing and vision are like probably the top filtering senses. But then the cool thing is that like I've also seen a lot of instances where if somebody like you are constantly, in that theory especially, if you're constantly filtering things, it means that those inputs are actually hitting and they have to be filtered. So it doesn't mean that you consciously are like, that guy's shirt is green, but if you just walk by some random person on the street, you're not like, oh, green shirt, squirrel, blue shoelace, because you'd go nuts, like you'd go fucking crazy. But the thing that's cool is that people can consistently recall those details when in a calm setting, and if they, especially if you go into a bit of a meditative state, and then you can and it doesn't even have to be very long, it'd just be 30 seconds or something, but people can recall extreme detail of what they saw, but filtered. So that's interesting too. So there's something to the compounds themselves tend to just like make you hyper perceptive, and biologically, it's a reality. Like your vision gets way better, your hearing gets way better. Like we were at top of a mountain once, and I won't say who I was with, but after psilocybin, pretty healthy amount, just chilling, but there was a bunch of other people there, and it was noisy. It was kind of like just event scenario, and I noticed that I could hear everything. Like I could hear every conversation, even across the room, that I normally absolutely would not be able to hear. And it was kind of crazy, but it was every single conversation coming in at once. And
wow,
but you could perceive it, and you could tell like who was saying it, and blah blah blah. So then it was like trying to direct focus of like, all right, who's saying that? Trying to figure out where the noise is coming from. But I thought that was really interesting because that had never happened to me before. But it was like weird. I was like, holy crap, how can I hear everything that people are saying? Like even on the other side of the wall kind of thing, like you could hear everything. So it's something, the biological effect definitely has something to do with your just like blasting open perception, physically and mentally, which is interesting because they're like, there's definitely a dual effect of that. Your sensory organs are definitely working in overtime, but the mental perception thing coupled with that same exact time is also, that's something that is a lot harder to measure, way more subjective. But everyone consistently really reports like on good experiences of like extreme benefits of kind of opening up stuff and
Empathy.
Yeah,
That's a big one.
Yeah, like an understanding at the empathetic level, I guess.
So kind of along with that, from the emotional state, what is your perception of the metaphysical level that a lot of people tend to associate with these different experiences?
Like, it could be more specific.
Well, I guess you could say spiritual instead of metaphysical. Like, what is your kind of perception or opinion on the spirituality aspect of a lot of these different experiences?
Well, I think everything has like a biological basis in a human experience. But then that would go back to the concept of like the observer being required for something to happen. So there's definitely like some root operating system in our body that allows for that intense spiritual thing. And most of the time, I don't think we're very tapped into it. And it, it might make sense that we're not, because we still have to operate in the physical world. We can't just like transcend as holy beings into the realm of our minds, right? But it's definitely like it's a two-part thing. It's what it seems like, especially because of the ubiquity of like these compounds having that effect that is so archetypical across populations of people, that and then they've been used for psilocybin at least for many thousands of years, and you can see evidence of it in every culture. And then I'm curious about it in the sense that it would feed into as evidence of like the idea that mushrooms are this like extremely co-evolved plant with humans, where all the gods in every civilization throughout recorded history seem to have very, very similar archetypes, to the point where people are like, this is that, like this Roman god is this Greek god, and it's just a different name. Well, part of that could be just like translation of a culture, because Rome and Greece were close to each other. The other aspect is that when you look in like Mayan civilization or place in Malaysia that's thousands of years old, they still find evidence of like these similar archetypical gods, or like Norse gods. And at times where these certain god structure, like mind structures, like these beings that people were talking about, were all in like completely different parts of the world, and are like in their cultures, at times specifically when people don't believe we could really travel over those lengths, especially if you looked at like across the Atlantic. But that's also kind of being blown wide open in terms of like archaeology. But I don't know. It's kind of it's just interesting. It's a pattern there. I don't know the answer to that, but it seems like people, like the mushroom itself, seems to like have played a part or potentially played a correlation in the development of a lot of these archetypical like spiritual entities in cultures. And it makes sense. I mean, because it does tend to be like this consistent. And that's what I think it's Terrence McKenna always says. He's like, it's just like this consistent same thing every time. Whereas I think he compares it to meditation, where meditation is like takes a lot of work to get into a meditative state. It takes a lot of discipline, practice, which is not a bad thing at all. But the people report psychedelic experiences in deep meditations and visions and that sort of thing. So there's something biologically rooted, even independent of like psilocybin, for example, or some compound binding to some receptor, that is like in our biology to encourage that experience. But meditation would take more work, according to Terence McKenna, than taking psilocybin to achieve a similar experience. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's just what I think about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how do you relate something similar along the lines of like the theories in the Kabbalion and kind of their perception of the all or the mind? How do you kind of relate that back to that experience?
I guess for people that don't know, the Kabbalion is it's a book on kind of the core tenets of Hermetic laws, which, the Hermetic laws are, apparently the story goes, I guess, is like really what, like back to ancient Egyptian times of like, Hermes being like this overly wise and enlightened God king type person who had these laws that were taught, right? But the cool thing about it is like the Kabbalion is more, I think it was written in the early 1900s or late 1800s as a distillation of all that stuff. It's very like almost so common sense that you're like, how did I not know that or realize it? But then it's one of those things where it's like, everything is vibrating. All is mind, like it all starts in your head kind of thing. Just a lot of this stuff it's like it should be common sense. But then also the cool thing is that if you read back history of like Isaac Newton, for example, he actually based most of his discoveries off of studying Hermetic philosophy and being obsessed with it and translating it into the physical world. So a lot of what, you find these like ancient philosophers, not ancient, he's not ancient, but these ancient ones too, like Pythagoras used it a lot. But someone like Isaac Newton or Galileo were using these just core tenets really to like put roots in the physical world of like, how is the physical world actually the natural world working, and is it, it's almost like they were testing it to see if it worked in real life kind of thing. But it led to like huge breakthroughs in science, whereas like these are thousands of years old, these core ideas. I think it translates because there's some sort of, I'm just convinced there's some sort of like pattern mechanism in humans, and there's like a foundational system that is there that we just don't fully understand yet in relation to the environment that we're in right now, the reality. So I think it's just all like pieces to the puzzle of people trying to learn more. I think that's really what science was originally supposed to be about. Just this never-ending movement forward and process oriented into discovering the truth about the physical world. Albeit now it's very different. Some of that exists for sure, but it seems like most of it's turned into its own religion.
Yeah, it's kind of the basic principle of the Ouroboros, kind of like the consistent pattern throughout all of humanity and existence in itself.
Yeah, like the rise and rebirth or death, eating yourself kind of thing. Like, yeah, there's patterns everywhere. That's why I'm convinced intuition is just pattern recognition.
Okay.
Like very advanced pattern recognition.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate?
Well, intuition is like when you just know something, right? Just like, I know I have to do that. It's the right choice or blah, blah, blah. I think we're so sensory oriented that we read a million things, we listen to a million things, we talk to a million people. You see everything, even though you're filtering things, you hear everything. There's an element and the fact that like we exist in an electromagnetic spectrum of perceivable and imperceptible wavelengths, that there would be inputs constantly, even if you're not able to perceive them. So it's the pattern recognition of intuition, in my opinion, would be that it's just a matter of like your ability to get in tune with a very advanced pattern set. And so some people are just not intuitive at all, and I think it's just because they're like shut out to it. But then you see it in action too. If you sit down and meditate for 30 minutes every day and just start like allowing yourself to kind of calm down and receive that sort of information, I guess. And then it starts, certain things just pop up and you're like, oh yeah, got to do that. Even if you have no intention of that.
That's about the extent of the questions that I can think of at the moment.
Okay. Well, then we'll put a disclaimer on this. We're not telling you to do drugs. Don't do drugs. Yes. Drugs are such an interesting word too. Anything's a drug, really. But we're not telling you to take psilocybin or LSD or MDMA or ayahuasca or anything. So I'll put that disclaimer in here because I ain't trying to get in trouble with some lawyers. Enough of them lawyers. But hopefully this just sheds some light on like personal opinions about it and knowledge. It's still a very, very open book because the research on psychedelics is extremely immature, like formal research. But a lot of the interesting stuff you can find about them is in old text, like in cultures that use them a lot, like the Nordic cultures, highly like heavy users. The shamanic practices, old just mythology translations, I guess, of certain things. Like they're all interesting. I don't know what any of the answers are to any of it, but it's interesting to read. And there's a lot more of that stuff than there is formal research on this right now. And most of the research is being done in like therapeutic settings for PTSD, depression, that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in that, you might want to check out MAPS and read through what they're doing. Yeah. And Johns Hopkins is doing a lot.
Yeah, Johns Hopkins has a lot of really interesting research that they're doing right now.
Hopefully this was helpful. Let us know any questions in the Thermo group, Thermo Diet community group on Facebook that you might have. We're also pretty soon, if you're listening to this in real time, we're launching a ton of new cool stuff. Got the Umzu Fit community coming up soon. So a lot of, it's going to be a fitness aspect to everything. And we'll have other stuff in that community as well, like cooking and more, other interesting topics. And it's going to be a community, though. It'll be a place where you can interact. And we want to build a really strong, awesome group there. And it's going to be a mobile app, too. So we got that, and then a bunch of new cool products like personal care, dog treats for joints, and new
snack bars.
Yeah, the bars.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait for those to be here.
Yep, we got some delicious bars coming out. Brownie batter is definitely the best flavor, but they're all good. Pumpkin spice, really good. Blueberry muffin. And if you have any other ideas for flavors that you want, we're going to probably launch 1 or 2 new bar flavors on Black Friday this year. So let us know in the group. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening and watching. Like and subscribe. If you like the podcast, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. That would be helpful to us, and we'd appreciate that a lot. Again, check out the Thermo Diet group, and we'll see you on the next episode.